I heard a number of folks join after we started. Just to recap, everybody earlier today, the Senate and the White House agreed on the scope and use of additional funding that many folks have been calling Stimulus Bill 4, and that's going to lead to another round of triple P funding through the Small Business Administration in the amount of $310 billion. And so if you have applied and not heard, applied and been rejected because all the money's run out, we encourage you to reach back out to your banks this afternoon or tomorrow and ask them to, basically put you back in line for the next round of funding. Dr. Hayden, we'll pause here and see if there are any questions.
Okay, if you have a question, be sure to unmute yourself and let's see if anybody has concerns.
Hi, thanks for that recap. I'm curious about, I just started my business in November in healthcare. I don't have any full-time employees. Do I have a sort of an independent contractor employee that can do tasks for me at home? As far as coming up with formatting forms and a book and, tasks that she doesn't have to be in the office to do for me. Is that an eligible employee?
Well, if I heard you right, ma'am, that it sounds like this person is an independent contractor. So my initial reaction is no, you wouldn't have to worry about emergency FMLA or sick day leave.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. And I hope that that your new business will continue to survive and thrive once this is all through.
Thank you. Thank you. We're limping along, but we're still afloat. Thank you.
Good. Good. Any other questions?
Yeah, this is Davis. I've got a question about the forgiveness on the PPP. So if you reduce your employees' hours, but within the 25%, the state of Georgia says if you have any reduction of hours, you have to report those hours for unemployment on the state of Georgia level. So we have employees whose hours were cut 5 hours. State of Georgia is making up the difference on their 5 hours, and then if they get any state of Georgia unemployment, they're also qualifying for $600 per week on federal. So they're actually making more money being reduced 5 hours than they were making before when they were working full time. So wow. My question is, they're very happy. My question
is, say that's a windfall for those employees.
Yeah. Is there any penalty on the employer on the state unemployment right now that they are qualifying for, or on the federal? Does any of that come back off the PPP, or are there any other penalties for having your folks filing for the reduced hours under unemployment?
That's a good question. In a complicated scenario, I will say at the outset that there's no real penalty on the federal side. The issue is that if it turns out at the end of all this that more than 75% of your triple P funding has been used for something besides payroll, then that means that portion won't be forgivable. But I'm not aware of any penalties short of just outright fraud and your misrepresentation on the application itself. But on the Georgia side, I think that you raise a great point. If Georgia, and Zeke and Sarah and I were talking about this this morning, Davis, how to address Georgia's changes in Department of Labor rules. I think the upshot is that as long as you're following both, you should be in good shape, and that you're not going to have to repay anything to either. I guess the question is, do you still need to apply for or report this to Georgia DOL if your employees are getting made whole by the federal program? I think I'm going to answer my own question and then get Sarah and Zeke to chime in. I would think that because the reporting trigger for that requirement is the reduction in hours, that you should, even if the employees are making up on the federal side. But Sarah and Zeke, what do y'all think?
So Rich, like one of the explicit purposes of the PPP program is to bring people back to full-time employment. So if an employer gets that funding, then that reduction in hours, even if there isn't work there, the employee should be brought back to full-time equivalency. And so unemployment payments for a DOL would be off the table. And like I said, that's just one of the underlying foundational goals of it, where even if the employee in the short term may be making more money with that $600, it's going to, I think it's there for an additional 8 weeks. It's not there forever. Where if you receive those funds, then you as the business owner should bring the employee back to full-time equivalency.
Zeke, that's a great point. Davis, we had just talked about that a few minutes ago. You'll have this situation where with the Triple P funding, you need to bring folks back to full-time, even if there's not much for them to do. And I think that's a good application of it. Zeke is a great point that you would say, okay, everybody, you're coming back full-time because we got this Triple P funding, but we're going to put you on, ancillary duties like marketing materials, filing, that kind of thing. Sarah, do you have anything to add?
No, I agree.
All right, great. Any other questions before we move on to the conclusion of our presentation? Okay, we have a couple of, so we talked at the outset about Governor Kemp's order from last night. Just as a reminder, it's set to expire April 30th, which felt like it would never arrive, but it is at the end of next week. And in the meantime, you see here, we gave you a little highlight on what businesses are allowed to reopen and when. But just to reiterate, for those of you who joined us after the start of the webinar, the governor's emergency order specifically says if you are in any business related to healthcare, you're encouraged to reopen just as soon as possible, that you're considered critical infrastructure and should reopen and resume business as soon as you can, following those CDC guidelines on social distance and sanitizing generally. If you have any questions about that, the governor's order also includes, I want to say 15, 20 different components about how to handle coworkers and what the emergency order refers to as customers. And we're happy to send that to you. And this just reiterates what those requirements are. I think most businesses have already figured out how to telework, but the simple fact is you can't adjust somebody over telehealth, and so you've got to bring those patients back in just as soon as possible. I think, frankly, in terms of reopening, your marketing message, your communication to your existing patient base is not just, hey, we're reopened, come visit us and let us treat you, but that here are the standards that we're going to meet in the process of reopening, so you can feel comfortable coming for treatment here. Zeke or Sarah, anything to add about that?
OSHA has also issued guidance on workplace safety, and so from a risk management perspective, it's also important to make sure that you're complying with those requirements.
Let me mention, speaking of risk management, Sarah, thank you for reminding me. Dr. Barnett over the weekend sent me an email asking about what liability chiropractors have, or any really medical business, what liability you have for potentially exposing a patient to the virus. In the particular situation that he mentioned, he had heard of some physician out there in Georgia somewhere who had been negligent in the handling of a COVID-19 test and really caused members of the patient base who were in the practice some panic because they worried they had been exposed. Governor Kemp on April 20th, no, the April 20th was yesterday. Governor Kemp on April 14th issued an emergency order that put many healthcare workers in Georgia in the category of emergency management, basically giving them, kind of immunity from these kinds of liabilities, because just like firefighters and police are immune, so can these emergency workers in the course of this pandemic. It's really important, though, to know, because that's been written about a good bit in the last week in the news in Georgia. It's important to know that those circumstances are limited to being in a hospital or other kind of licensed facility in the state. So I think it includes hospitals and various kinds of imaging centers. but specifically does not include a chiropractic office or general physician practice. So even though the governor has extended this immunity to a variety of healthcare workers, including physicians and chiropractors, it's only in a hospital-based setting that it would apply. So what that means is that you should treat your patients in the way that you always have, following that standard of care, but make sure you follow those requirements of the CDC to the fullest extent possible, because if someone does get exposed to COVID-19 in your office and blames you, your protection will be, hey, we followed the CDC guidelines to the T, and if you got it, you didn't get it here. I think that's your best defense. Zeke or Sarah, do you have any additional thoughts about that potential malpractice issue?
I think just like Sarah reiterated, just because you're doing these best practices, documentation is always going to be your best friend, to make sure that you're not only doing it, but you have some sort of documentation evidencing the steps that the practice took in terms of sanitation, signs postage, you know, monitoring patients as they're coming in and out, etc. Where, you know, God forbid something does happen, that you are able to turn over that documentation then of, we did A, B, and C as recommended. We're not sure. Talk to somebody else.
Exactly. Go look somewhere else. All right. Let me see. I think this is the, yeah. He also mentioned in this emergency order from